Hopefully the second time is a charm. Okay. All right. Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the Sunday garden question and answer video that I do on Sundays. You can ask gardening questions down below this video, and I pick from those each week to answer. This is take 2 for this video. I had a corrupted card somehow when I shot this morning. I'm shooting it on Saturday. Happy Father's Day, because if you're watching this on Father's Day, to any of the fathers that are watching, and thanks everybody for your participation in the channel. Last weekend I was at a plant symposium in Raleigh. Buddy Lee ended up here touring the garden, lots of other friends from other places and new friends, and lots of opportunity coming up this summer in my travels for my Plant Master series. You guys are just going to be blown away with the places that I'm going and the people that we are going to have on the channel, and the gardens, the great American gardens that are actually going to be on this channel this year. So thank you guys for watching and participating in the channel, because you're responsible for a lot of that opportunity for me to travel and do these things. So thank you very much. Put up a video with Ram and Tom Giberson, kind of explaining a little bit of the history of their garden down there in Athens, Georgia. I have 2 more videos from that where I go through one more of the fountains, naming most of the plants that are in the fountain, and one other, a little drainage swell area that's in that garden. So those videos will be, when I get them edited, they'll be going up as well. So anyway, I think that covers a lot of what happened this past week and what's happening later in the summer with travels. And I'm super excited to take you guys to a couple of the places that I'm going this summer. About almost any time a plant comes up that's new, that's interesting, you know, a couple of these people are, you know, their names come up for having, you know, brought it back or named it or know something about it, that kind of thing. So that should be super interesting. So let's get to some questions. One of the questions, a couple things have come up recently, either from emails from folks or just kind of in the news, is compost that has chemical residues in it. So basically toxic compost. You guys can Google this, look this up. There's a few herbicides that don't break down in the composting process, and they've become wider and wider used. Glyphosate, which is the ingredient that's in Roundup, is no longer on patent. So you can buy glyphosate from a lot of different companies. Glyphosate is not as effective as it used to be. There's a lot of weeds that it just doesn't, you know, just laugh at it at this point, because it's been around so long. So we've kind of been upping the game on, you know, herbicides that are being used. So like the electric company spraying along, you know, their right-of-ways, and, you know, farmers spraying, and, you know, around posts and poles and fences and all kinds of things, you know, new chemicals or newer herbicides being used. Some of these herbicides are not breaking down in the environment the same way, and so there's a lot of stories about toxic compost. I am not going to bring compost in to this garden anymore in bulk. I had a friend in Durham doing a landscape job, got toxic compost, and what it looks like with your plants that you're growing in it looks like they've been sprayed with a herbicide, but it's in the compost. The plants look, maybe the leaves look deformed. You're getting odd growth on them, that kind of thing. But there's a group of chemicals that are responsible for this, and apparently it's in Europe as well. Not over-the-shelf kind of chemicals. They're kind of chemicals that only, you know, they're only available to farmers and businesses and, you know, that kind of thing. But they're ending up in our compost. So it apparently takes several years for these compounds to break down. So I'm going to be super cautious going forward, getting compost in bulk, just because it worries me that I would add a herbicide to my landscape, which could be quite devastating. Bagged products, I have no idea. One of the questions I have coming up is, you know, talking about the difference between, you know, bagged compost, like mushroom compost versus cow manure. We might as well go ahead and talk about that. You know, I've used cow manure on a couple landscape installations recently, but I didn't go to the store and buy the cow manure. When I did the landscape job down in Southern Pines at the Weymouth Center, they had bought the cow manure already, the black cow manure. So we used it. And then a landscape job I did, that I put up the fourth part of this landscape job over here around the corner recently. And I used cow manure in it. There was already cow manure there. There were just bags of cow manure, so I went ahead and used it. I don't often buy it. It does have a little bit of nitrogen component to it, so you're slightly more likely to damage your plants, and so, you know, with you know, almost over fertilizing them. So when I use it, I just use a small shovelful mixed in with the soil, and you're not going to have any problems if you do that. Just don't go crazy and use a half a bag of cow manure on a shrub, because you could potentially burn the roots on it. But I mean, mushroom compost is safe. You can use cow manure. Just, you know, again, I don't use that much of it. Whatever bagged product, I'm hoping that they're not that they wouldn't have these same issues that I'm talking about with the toxic compost. But I think this story is going to be bigger in time if we're going to use herbicides that aren't going to break down. You know, the one thing about glyphosate's been in the news 1,000 different ways, and, you know, lawsuits and, you know, cancer risk people talk about and everything. But that chemical's been around a long time, and it does break down in the environment. You know, that's one thing about it. You know, it gets used, it's overused. I mean, my God, it's massively overused. They spray it across our crops, you know, to kill weeds in fields, you know what I mean? So we're eating the stuff. So it's massively overused, but where it's used properly and following safety guidelines, it breaks down in the environment rather quickly. And so it has been a good tool in the war chest for a long time, but like I say, it has become less effective over the years. I read somewhere, somebody told me that there were as many as like 25 weeds that just, like, you know, laugh at it at this point. I don't know if that's true or not. I do remember mustard down at the nursery when we would spray glyphosate around our nursery beds. Mustard and a few other things were just like, nope. And I think it eats glyphosate. Okay. Somebody asked me about a second fertilizing. You know, I fertilized way earlier in the year. This year, it was almost like at the end of January or early February. I fertilized this entire landscape. The turf, the beds, everything that's here, all got fertilized at one time. They wanted to know about a second fertilizing for things that are deemed heavy feeders. And one of the things that they pointed out was daylilies. They heard daylilies were heavy feeders. Well, see, I don't need, so it doesn't matter whether something's a heavy feeder or not out here in this garden, because the combination of beneficial bacteria, beneficial fungi, the plant roots themselves, the fact that I've got everything planted in the soil, so, you know, other than my containers, we'll talk about containers in just a second. So they have access to the mineral content that's in the actual soil. I haven't replaced it, you know, I mended it a little bit. And then the fertilizing that I did do, the composting that I've done in the past, the mulches that I've applied to it that are breaking down. I don't need a second fertilizing. All that fertilizing is taking place. I left my leaves in place back here, if you followed along through the fall. So the leaves are still breaking down at this point. And there are plenty of nutrients available back here. I don't need a second round of fertilizer for any shrub, tree, ground cover, anything that's in the ground. The only things that I will apply a second round to will be my containers, because the containers, again, they don't have access to the minerals in the ground that you do from soil. This clay, which people complain about, does have a lot of mineral content. So, you know, I don't need a second round. My vegetable garden, you know, annual plants in my vegetable garden, although technically tomatoes and peppers are perennials, but they're annuals here. I will fertilize those a second time about midsummer. So annuals, maybe some of the annual flowers that are around the sides. If I feel like they're slowing down, I'll give them a second round of fertilizer. But you can see, no, you can't see. But if you look at my tour video that I did walking around with the stabilizer the other day, it's a relaxing tour with birds or something I called it. If you watch that video, you can see how lush everything is, how many flowers I have, how much growth is on these things, and it ain't fertilizer doing it. I mean, the fertilizer I put down was way back now, or in the early part of the year. what's driving all of this now is just the organic material that's on the top, and me protecting all the beneficials that are under the soil with that barrier that I have on the top. And the plants now close enough together that they're shading their own roots, and so they're not feeling those kind of heat stresses and things that other people's plants are, where they've got them so far spaced apart, or they're out in the middle of their lawn with little rings around them and that kind of thing. Those are stressful conditions for plants in the summertime. So again, no. Could have said no. How long ago could Jim said no to him? I'm doing a second round of fertilizer. Okay, somebody asked me how to wet dry peat moss. If you've ever bought peat moss before, it typically comes in a, they dry it and then they shrink it basically by, as they dry it, and then they compress it. You get it as a bale, and it is kind of hard to re-wet. There are wetting agents that people use in peat moss that you can add, but what we always did was we cut the bags open, put whatever we were going to use into a wheelbarrow, and then we put water in the wheelbarrow and walked away. And that's really all you need to do. Just wait, just time. But that's how I always did it at the nursery, was in a wheelbarrow, sitting in the water, and it soaks it up over a couple of hours or so. Again, I'm not using any peat moss here, or I'm trying to get away from using peat moss just from a sustainability standpoint. But to answer your question, soak it in a wheelbarrow. It works great. Somebody asked me if the pollinators, this is a pretty good question, if the pollinators like the hybrid or named cultivars of natives as much as the straight species of natives. And just to explain this, out on the road, out at the street here, I've got Echinacea purpureans, a straight native species Echinacea. I mean, you could go out and find it in the wild. It's the exact same plant. Just down from that, I've got 3 other Echinaceas that are hybrids. They are named cultivars. They're crossed with one another. They're crossed maybe with different species to create new, more compact, more floriferous, plants that are for the retail market, so that they're super, super showy at retail. I've got this Powell wildberry over here. You can see that in the walk around video day before maybe 3 days ago as you're watching this, my weekly tour video, it was in that. It's just absolutely covered in flowers. What they wanted to know is if the bees got just as much out of them. Somebody's deemed these plants nativars, so they're natives, but they have named varieties, so they just put the nativar. I don't know who named them that, but that's the name that's been given. Some people that have native gardens only want the straight species. They don't want any of the hybrids. I don't see any difference. I mean, I can walk out there and we can see bees, native bees. Native bees are the important part, not honeybees or non-native flying insects. The natives are on all of them. They don't seem to care. Whether there's some actual difference in them, I have no idea. Keep in mind that in the wild, these plants are crossing. You can find hybrids in the wild where you can see, 2 species have crossed. Whether that cross holds up and it can produce seed, becomes a new species, becomes a subspecies, who the heck knows? But in the wild, this is how new plants happen. So it's not that this is uncommon. This is just humans have got involved and really pushed the envelope on it to make them, again, more compact, more floriferous, make more money on them, obviously. I don't see any difference in them, but I'm not a bee, so I don't know. Another example of it is I got the dwarf Joe Pye weed. It's probably out of the camera angle. That little Joe Pye weed, and then I've got the straight species Joe Pye weed in the front garden. It's 10 feet tall now, and this one is maybe 5.5 feet tall. When they start blooming in 2 or 3 weeks, there'll be just as many bees on this one as there was the one in the front yard. They don't seem to know the difference, but maybe there is. I don't know the answer, but it doesn't, for me, just as a general observation, I have a lot of straight species natives here, and I have a lot of named cultivar hybrid natives, and I don't see any difference in them. So, who knows? Okay. Somebody asked me, they don't see a lot of roses in the garden, and why not? The Raleigh Rose Garden is about 5 or 6 blocks from me, and so if I want roses, I can have all the beautiful roses in the world 5 or 6 blocks from here. I don't like, they're just a lot of maintenance, and they do require spraying to keep them clean. That, that rose garden probably glows in the dark. There's so many things probably applied over there. It's beautiful. And there's a crowd over there, I'm sure. Today I'm shooting this on, like I said, on Saturday, and it's like 80. We're getting a break from our upper 90s for a couple days here. We're in the mid 80s, and I'm sure there's a crowd of people over there to see those roses today. They're beautiful. Not my thing. That's all. I've got one low growing ground cover rose back toward the back here. That's a Southern Living Plant Collection one. It's been great, super clean. It blooms heavy. I cut it back. It blooms heavy again. Very little maintenance on it, and I do like it. Now, do things in the rose family count? The roses are in a family called Rosaceae. It's a big, giant family of plants, and I've got Indian hawthorns, and I've got my serviceberry out front, and probably several other things that are in the rose family. Pyracantha, I don't have a pyracantha, but I did at the old house. That's in the rose family. So, do those count? That's my question to you guys. Does an Indian hawthorn count as a rose since it's in the same family? I don't know. At some point, I'm going to cover plant families, because I think it might be interesting just to see how many of the things in this garden are related, and which plant family do I have the most of, from one plant family. I'm sure it's going to be Lamiaceae. That's the mint family. The mint family contains salvias and mints and most of your herbs like rosemary. The vitex is in Lamiaceae. Most of the things that you can rub the leaves and are pungent. A lot of them have square stems. Just a super interesting family of plants. That's probably will be the winner when I get around to doing that video, but I might, it's probably going to be Lamiaceae. Anyway, I got roses. They just don't look like roses. Okay. Somebody wants a ground cover for sun or shade that's kind of non-invasive. I had a couple of questions, based on ground cover questions like that. I would avoid English ivy, Vinca major. What else? Definitely Liriope spicata, the one that suckers. Those are aggressive and are hard to remove. The ivy seeds itself, the Vinca, they're just, but almost all ground covers are trying to cover the ground. So the only ground covers that would not be invasive at all are going to be things like shrubs. So let's say I'm using something like that abelia, that gold abelia back there, which stays super, super low and gets wide. And I'm calling that a ground cover because kind of it is a ground cover. That plant, or some sort of low growing doming holly that just gets wider instead of tall, those are going to be the least invasive for covering ground. And then next up is going to be things like junipers, which are still kind of shrubs but just flatter growing, prostrate shrubs, ones that really, really grow very flat to the ground. Everything else, I don't care whether it's a juga or sedum or St. John's wort or even veronica. It doesn't matter. If it covers the ground, it's going to want to try to cover ground. A lot of those things, though, the sedum is not seeding itself over here. So when I cut it back to where I want to keep it, it's not seeded itself over there. It has to grow back into that area. So I have time in between. The gold St. John's wort over there, that little clump's getting wider, but I can just take a shovel over there and chop that back pretty easily. So, but again, if you're going into the ground cover game, you can expect to have some maintenance, but avoid the ones that are really, really bad. And also, every state has a invasive list. And so if I'm in North Carolina, I can easily Google North Carolina invasive plants and find some sort of list that's divided by trees, shrubs, and ground covers, vines. And know the ground covers that I should avoid if you're worried about them being invasive. Every state, there's a university in some sort of ag-based university in your state that probably maintains that list that could be helpful to you. Somebody has a Japanese maple, and a few of the branches have gotten some damage on them over a couple of years, and they're there, but they only have a couple leaves on them, and they're not leafing completely back out. If they cut them off, the plant's is not going to be attractive anymore, and so they're just trying to see if they can get some growth on them. What I would do is cut the ends on any branch initially. If you're bending it and it's alive, you scratch it, you scratch the bark if it's green underneath. If the branch is alive, it just doesn't have a lot of growth along it, I would just cut them back just a bit. Rather than cut them completely off, try just pruning them some, and I would do that sooner than later. A lot of times pruning things will stimulate new growth, but sometimes you got to do major surgery. You may find if you cut them completely off, if you have to at some point, that you can then prune the rest of the tree just a bit at the same time and force new growth to fill out the empty space. So step one, prune them a little bit. Step two, take them out and then prune the whole plant to try to get them to fill back in. Okay, somebody asked about, do they need to prune? We talk about pruning. I put up pruning videos, and then I think people think that you have to prune, but you don't have to prune. And this question was about pruning newer plants after they flower. Should you prune them to make them fuller? If you've got crazy limbs on things, I would definitely take that off whenever. But newer planted things, I'm probably not going to do just any general pruning on them till they've been established for a little while. I don't want to double down on stress, on the plant. Sometimes I'll plant something and I'll go ahead and prune it when I plant it just to lower the transplant shock if the plant's trying to grow. But the kind of general pruning on it in that first 6 months, 9 months, a year, you don't have to. And keep in mind, you don't have to prune anything. I feel like I've got to be in control of everything, so I'm out here micromanaging the pruning, trying to make every plant look just like I want it to look. You don't have to do that. You can plant something and just leave it alone. If it gets a crazy limb on it, you can cut it off. If it gets way too big, you can prune it after it flowers 1 year very hard. But no real rules on you having to prune it anytime soon. Somebody wanted to plant clethra and butterfly bushes together. Maybe wanted a color choice. They'll totally play nice together. Clethra is a native, butterfly bush is not. But there are newer butterfly bushes that are seed, that don't produce seed if you're worried about them being invasive. Here in the Southeast, we don't have that invasive issue on them that they do in the Pacific Northwest and in Europe, in parts of Europe. So we don't really have to worry about that. I'd probably put the clethra in the back. Because the clethra you're not going to cut way hard in the wintertime, whereas the butterfly bushes need to be cut down to about 18 inches in the late winter to perform their best and not crack apart. So I put the clethra in the back and then put smaller growing butterfly bushes in the front. If you're asking me about colors, almost all the colors are going to match because the clethras come in whites, pinks, and kind of reddish pinks, and then the butterfly bushes are just white, blue, purple, reddish pinks. There are a couple yellows, but they're inferior plants. But I think almost any of them are going to match one another. They will be blooming at the same time, so I can see where it's actually important. I love the white flowering clethra, like hummingbird, and then you can put whatever butterfly bush in front of it. If you're asking me what butterfly bush the butterflies prefer, this is kind of funny. I've got 5 butterfly bushes. I didn't mean to have 5 butterfly bushes. I'm not even that big of a butterfly bush fan, but somehow I've been gifted or whatever, and now I have, is it 5? May just be 4. 5. I've got one in a container over here. So I do have 5 butterfly, but I didn't mean to have 5 butterfly bushes. You might think I'm a giant fan of them, but not really. If you have them separated like I do across the entire landscape, they'll all have pollinators on them. But when I grew them at the nursery, you have 10 to 15 varieties growing together in the same space. The butterflies almost always picked the blue ones, and I have no idea why. So like Nanho blue, that kind of thing. And most of the seedling ones that you'll see coming up, when they do have seedlings, most of them are blue for some reason. Okay, somebody asked about how to underplant around roots. And, I've been talking a lot about underplanting shrubs. You know, your trees get taller, so you put shrubs underneath them. The shrubs get taller, and then they're getting a little naked underneath, and you can tuck things under there. They're just asking how you go about digging in those situations. The best thing to do is hopefully find smaller plant material. 1 gallon plant material is much easier to plant in heavy root conditions. Smaller plants tend to take less transplant shock in general. For years, the first 10 years I had my nursery, I was just growing trade gallon shrubs for other nurseries, and then I had a spot at the Raleigh Farmers Market. Trade gallon just means a 3-quart pot. For years we called the 1 gallon containers, we called them 1 gallon containers, but they were actually only 3 quarts. So now a lot of people call them trade gallons, because what it is it's not a 4-quart pot, it's a 3-quart pot. But I had a spot at the Raleigh Farmers Market, and I had a giant customer base for my trade gallon shrubs, because there were a lot of people who they were older and couldn't dig big giant holes in the ground, or they had roots like we're talking about, and it was easier to dig in those areas. Maybe they had heavy clay soil. Maybe they just like to watch plants grow like I do. And so I had a big market for smaller plants. I would encourage you, if you're a grower, you know, there's a big market for small shrubs, and for these various reasons. But you can get a root slayer shovel and hopefully buy things in small pots, and you can, you know, sometimes you got to work at it a little bit, but you can plant around those things. Their second part of their question was about when I've said a few times that existing plants don't play nice with newly planted things. So you plant something next to something that's been there for 10 years, it's going to have a big giant established root system, and it's going to have access to all the nutrients and the water and everything, and it's going to not on purpose, but it is going to potentially damage newly planted things. So you have to be very conscious of when you plant things around existing things. It can take a year or longer sometimes to establish something. Whereas I can plant something out here in this open bed and maybe go through one winter and not have to water it much the entire next year in our area where we get rain, as opposed to that back line back here where it's wooded. All the plants on that back line required a lot of water last year. This year, they're all holding up much better in kind of drought conditions. It has rained the last couple days, finally. But we have pretty much drought conditions the last 2 months or so. That stuff on that back line's done great. It took 2 years for some of those shrubs to get to that point where they weren't wilting almost every afternoon with the root competition. So if you do plant around existing things, know that that's going to take a little while longer and a little more water, a little more paying attention to get those things established. Somebody said they had a stupid question, and I just want to say that there are no stupid questions. You know, that's the point of this is just, you know, ask your question. I see that occasionally. Somebody will say this may be a stupid question, or this is a stupid question, or whatever. There are no stupid questions. They have a spider web growing between plants, and some of the branches on the 2 plants have browned a bit, and wanted to know if it's a problem. Probably not. On an old established shrub, I doubt you know, a spider web is going to hurt anything. You know, I invite spiders in here. I don't mind that there's spiders back here. They're you know, they're doing their thing. They're part of the environment. They're part of the natural world, and so I don't worry about them. And I doubt very seriously they would do any significant damage to established plants. Okay, somebody asked about having a dogwood. They have a dogwood planted near a sewer line, was worried about maybe it will damage it. Well, these are tough questions. I mean, I live in a neighborhood. Behind the camera back here, I can see down the street from me, 3 houses down, there's one of these 85-year-old oaks. There's another one behind me. This neighborhood is 80 to 100 years old, and so the oaks that are in this neighborhood were planted during that time. Raleigh is the city of oaks, for those of you who don't know. And we have these giant, you know, all types of giant oaks, and there's one of them right here. You know, it's definitely near a sewer line over there, and the whole neighborhood is like that. I don't know. It's tough to worry about, you know, those things. Dogwoods are fairly shallow rooted. I doubt that a dogwood's going to do any damage to the sewer line, but that's not to say it can't do any damage to the sewer line. And, you know, I'll let all of you be the judge, you know, of those kinds of things. I grew you know, I grew all kinds of things. I've planted all kinds of things near sewer lines. I'm not going to, you know, if the city utilities controlled everything that we could do on our properties, we would not be able to do very much in a lot of places. We have mostly above ground utilities in this neighborhood because of these old trees and because of the old stuff. But obviously the sewer and the water, you know, are underground, and cable for the most part is underground. But again, I doubt a dogwood's going to damage your sewer line, and if it did, it would be way, way, way down the road in all likelihood. Let's see. And then somebody else, are there ground covers to avoid? It's weird that I wrote that down again, but yes, they're going back to that list, the liriope, and you know, not the clumping liriope muscari, but the liriope spicata and ivy for sure. Obviously, English ivy, Banca major, and you know, there's a bunch of them. Again, look on your state's invasive plant list. I guarantee your state maintains some sort of list to, if they haven't banned the plant in your state and it's still available, they'll say, you know, discourage you from planting it. Okay. Somebody had a jewel box Distilleum. They received it in the mail and it had some significant burn on it. They were thinking it's probably fertilizer burn. Sorry. My guess it's actually from that freeze we had back in March. The Distilleum were quite badly damaged from that freeze, and so I think all the new growth will come back out on it. As long as it's showing signs that it's got new growth on it, it should be fine. My jewel box didn't get very much damage because it was back here in a protected space. My cast and bronze out in the front garden got quite a bit of damage. The Distilleum had started to wake up. They were starting to put on new growth at the time we had that freeze in mid-March, and so that's why they're no less cold tolerant than anything else in Zone 7. The silly things just woke up early and we had an extreme event. And so that's all that is. As long as it's got some new growth on it, I probably just wouldn't worry about it. Get it in the ground. Water it in, but don't overwater it. It probably doesn't need as much water if it's been slightly damaged. Somebody has a raised perennial bed and it has sunk down. So, you know, over time, they've lost about 5 or 6 inches of depth and they want to know what to do. You know, the problem for me to answer this question is there probably are some perennials that you could just go back in there and bury. So you could raise the thing up, and some perennials would just not mind having that additional burying of them. You know, you can plant tomatoes. Tomatoes are annuals here, but they are perennial plants. But, you know, you can plant them an extra 5, 6 inches down in the ground. Same thing with peppers. There's a lot of plants that you can actually, you know, bury fairly deep. I've always talked about keeping things raised up because you don't want to be overwatering things, loving things to death. But there are plants that would tolerate being sunk down deep, probably clethra we were talking about earlier, because it's one of those plants that, you know, roots under the ground, and you know, pops up all over the place. There's probably are plants in that bed that you could bury, but I don't know what's in that bed. So I would, if it were mine and I needed to raise that soil up, I'd be popping perennials out of the ground. I'm assuming they're easy to dig out if they've been in some sort of soil that was added to a raised bed. So, you know, I'm popping them out, putting the soil in there and replanting them. You know, nobody wants to hear that answer because that was a lot more work, but some things would probably tolerate being buried. Other things would not. And so I don't, you know, the risk seems high. Somebody had Baptisia and Coreopsis that were damaged by a dog, broken off by a dog, wanted to know if they would come back. It depends on how established they are, honestly. If you go buy a little quart pot Baptisia, or, you know, some sort of little quart pot perennial, and the dog breaks it off immediately, probably a lot of times that's not going to come back. If you had a full established 1 gallon one, or a plant that's come back from last year, it's probably more likely that it would come back. Only time will tell on something like that. Let's see. Somebody asked about watering their figs in a container, and how much it's going to take a lot of water if you have a fig in a container that you're trying to get finished figs off of. I know there's some, you know, advertising around, you know, having figs in containers and things. I grew figs in containers at a nursery, and I can tell you it's a nightmare. And I've got friends, I was at a friend's nursery last summer or the summer before, and he had a separate sprinkler system just dedicated to figs. And so the whole nursery would water, you know, they'd water the whole nursery, and then they had another little section they'd go and hand turn on just for the figs because they needed extra water. They're not particularly good container plants, even dwarf varieties. They just root so aggressively into a container, and so it's hard to keep up with the water, and you have to keep up with the water in order for them to produce the figs, because they'll drop the figs they'll either drop old leaves or drop the figs or not finished, or the figs will stay super hard. I've had container figs before that just never ripened. They just stayed really hard, you know, all through the winter. So it's going to take a lot of water to maintain one in a container. Might be that you could up pot it, like right now, if it had figs on it, if you could take it from that container that it's in, I don't know what size it's in, and put it into a slightly larger container to give it a little more root space. That might reduce the amount of water you're giving it and allow the plant to, you know, the very thirsty fig tree to get water. Somebody asked will a camellia adjust to the sun? So they planted a Camellia japonica in a very sunny spot, wanted to know if it would adjust. Camellia sasanquas are definitely a little more sun tolerant than japonicas, but I see old Camellia japonicas in lots and lots of sun, and yes, they did adjust to it. A newly planted one, you know, maybe not. If it's really burning the center of the leaves on them, then you probably do want to move it. It also depends on where you are, because, you know, we're talking about a plant that's hardy in zone 7 to 9. Up here in zone 7, you know, the sun might not be quite as bad as it is, you know, or the heat might not be quite as bad as it is in zone 9. So, you know, that would probably be part of the equation as well. They're probably more likely to take more sun up here in Raleigh than they are down in, you know, South Georgia someplace. So again, not knowing where you are would have some impact on that. So I'm going to stop right there. I don't know how many that was, maybe 20 or something like that. Thank you guys very much for participating in these question and answer videos. Ask gardening questions down below, and I will pick from those next week. Thanks for following along.